Ena mana, ena reo, ena karangatanga maha. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. This customary greeting in Te Reo Māori, which I'm very much expected to give, coming from New Zealand, in the Indigenous language of New Zealand, acknowledges all of you from all over the world, the wisdom and the perspective that you bring to our meeting, and conveys my absolute privilege to be here on behalf of Te Kahu Pairureo Tōtara Hospice. Now, it's after lunch, so if a Glaswegian of Scots Irish descent from New Zealand speaking Te Reo doesn't wake you up, then I don't know what's going to wake you up. Also, I really apologise if you expected a sun-kissed, 5'11", kind of blonde, surfy New Zealander and you got little old me, but there you have it. So, just before I start and sharing the Totara Hospice Journey, which is a journey of integrated palliative care and assisted dying, I just want to say out loud that I'm not here trying to tell anybody what to do. I am here to share a perspective in the hope that it helps others to build a roadmap, especially for those jurisdictions that are on the brink of change. I'm also not here to get drawn into a barking ideology war about palliative care. My view is that when we just bark at each other from different sides of a debate, the public lost trust and confidence in the system, and the patient voice gets lost. So although we have some quite different views to a lot of our palliative care colleagues, and we are not conflict averse in sharing those difference of views, it's very much my strong feeling that being able to discuss different perspectives and have respectful dialogue and look for genuine inquiry is really the way to join up system around common need. So really familiar, right? How many times a day do you see them on your badges, on your lanyards, on your computers? But when was the last time that you used them to really inform a decision about a direction that you should take? At Totara Hospice, as a leadership team of CEO, board and senior staff, that included our senior clinical staff, we used these to navigate our decision about whether or not we would support assisted dying if it was to become a legal choice in New Zealand. Coinciding with growing recognition of assisted death rights across advanced democracies like New Zealand, 2015 heralded the start of our very earnest work on the question of compatibility of legal assisted dying as part of our services. There had been attempts at law change in New Zealand in 1995, 2003, 2014. Then in mid-2015, public support really surged following the death of Lucretia Seales. Lucretia Seales, for those who don't know, was a bright lawyer who was based in Wellington, the Parliamentary Centre of New Zealand. She had a terminal illness, cancer, and she challenged the New Zealand High Court, arguing that the New Zealand Crimes Act conflicted with her rights under the New Zealand Bill of Rights. And she took a case to the High Court to challenge that. Although Justice David Collins did not rule in her favour, he did acknowledge the significance of her case, stating that her suffering highlighted the law's failure to accommodate her dignity and the law's failure to accommodate her autonomy. He urged Parliament to address the complex legal, philosophical, moral and clinical issues raised by the proceedings, and her case really jolted the ethical conscience and curiosity of New Zealand as a small nation, and it jolted ours too, that her autonomy and her dignity were not being upheld when, as a palliative care organisation, those attributes were central to our value proposition and to our identity. 4 months later in New Zealand, the MP David Seymour's end-of-life choice bill was lodged in the members' ballot, and overseas Carter versus Canada was very much underway. I was a therapist who went over to the dark side of management many years ago, and as a chief executive, in fact, for any chief executive, the job really involves acting as an organisational catalyst, a binding enzyme to align vision, values and purpose, to work with senior leaders to navigate change, to advise boards on critical issues and safely steer your organisation forward. With the question, Tōtara Hospice and Assisted Dying, to be or not to be, these role functions got super amplified for me over a long period. I was staunch. I felt that as a leading organisation in the care of the dying, we had purported to be so for over 40 years, that we had an obligation to our community to be proactive and to be able to transparently discuss the rationale for any position that we might take. And I felt particularly strong about that because in the New Zealand model, government funds palliative care 50% and communities fund palliative care 50%. Community is an equal shareholder that deserves equal respect and transparency and dialogue. Governance were clear with me that any position that we may end up on at the end of our process would be owned by them. That's totally appropriate. But they said, Tina, we do need a process to work through this. Traversing the complexity of issues highlighted by Lucretia Seals versus the Attorney General needed a robust framework. I recommended our vision, our purpose and values framework. This, after all, for me, was our transparent internal and external accountability contract. Governance agreed with this, and we also determined together that we did not in any way need to be theologists or medical legal experts or academics or ethicists. We could draw from that very fine work from those colleagues, but we just needed to be absolutely who we were. Importantly, and I think this was the most critical point, excuse me, I have some kind of histamine reaction going on, I'm sorry. The most critical point was that we agreed that to get to a decision with transparency and with integrity, we were obliged to distinguish facts from feelings, and we were obliged to distinguish and differentiate our kitchen tables from the board table. This all sounds very methodical and very organised and very smooth. I can absolutely assure you it was not. It was instinctive and hilly, and we began a multi-year journey of combined intensity and rest periods with a rough map but a quality compass. So here they are, our vision, purpose and values framework. And it's my expectation that Tōtara, that these sit bone deep within our leadership psyche as our accountability marker, that we deliver the type of palliative care that we say we do on the packet. We asked ourselves, would the legal choice for assisted death be something we could support when considered through this framework? Is there conflict with our framework? Well, our vision, honour living, dignify dying. This is nuanced and it demands we ask, whose definition of honour and dignify is paramount? The patient, the patient, the patient, the patient. The Te Reo Māori version is particularly strong in highlighting this. Ko te whakahonere I te ora. This is to convey, to bring, to make, or to act respect, esteem, or honour towards the living, a life, or the essence of a life. Ko te whakarangatira I te mate is to make the suffering person, the dying person, the leader, literally, Whaka rangatira I te mate. Whaka indicates a verb. Rangatira is the leader. So to make the dying person the leader. To uphold their personal dignity and autonomy in and through death. We found that there was no conflict with assisted dying in our vision. So what about our values? Pride. Well, we're proud to work to ease suffering. There can be no conflict there. What about professionalism, embracing the highest ethical standards? We provide excellent care. We know that through our data. But something was lingering about the definition of palliative care and the position that our wider sector holds or held. There was potential conflict there that we couldn't ignore. Inclusion. We worked to be a safe space for all. There couldn't be conflict for those who wanted to choose an assisted death. Innovation, finding new ways of doing things, no conflict. Compassion, concern for the situation and circumstances of those we care for. How could there be conflict? No conflict. Is there conflict or alignment with our purpose as you read it and experience it? Well, we're not afraid to lead at the edge, but again, the definition of palliative care lingered around the edge of our feelings around this, and there was potential conflict. So AD seemed to align with our vision, and it mainly aligned with our values, but it had tension potentially with our professional purpose. So palliative care identity was to become our main consideration. So we thought, let's put pride and compassion and innovation and inclusion and professionalism beside values of palliative care. And Greg's slides very much highlighted these earlier today. Does assisted dying have conflict with the values of palliative care? And I'm talking about values, not definition. Values. Values of empathy and compassion, respect and care for the circumstances of each person. No conflict. Respect for the inherent worth of each individual human being. No conflict. Autonomy and dignity, empowering patients to make informed decisions about their rights and care, including refusal or discontinuing treatment. Common practice, no conflict. Holistic care, understanding pain to alleviate suffering, no conflict. Patient-centered care, no conflict. Inclusion, recognizing and respecting difference and being competent in that management of difference, no conflict. Collaboration, a team-based approach to meeting needs, including a multidisciplinary team, an interdisciplinary team, and a team of providers around a common network. Assisted dying aligned with the values of palliative care. There was no conflict. As we worked across this in 2016-17, MAID was now legal in Canada and we were paying attention. And at home, the End of Life Choices Bill was drawn from the members' ballot. It had passed its first reading via conscience vote in December. And we thought, we are glad we are doing this work because this is going to be it. And we owe it to our patients, our community, and to our employees to be prepared. On our doorstep, the state of Victoria and Australia had just legalised assisted dying for the terminally ill to take effect in 2019. We observed growing public support. And despite similar polls in New Zealand, we heard through our own network that palliative care in Victoria were unprepared, thinking that the law wouldn't get passed and that they appeared to be shocked. Again, we were happy that we were doing this work because preparation was everything, and we were determined that whatever position we ended up taking, we would know that position, communicate that position, and not leave the patient or the clinicians lost in a fog of no man's land of ideology. I took one of the biggest decisions of my career at that point, and I recommended to the Tōtara board that we stand apart from Hospice New Zealand, the country's main body for palliative care. My reason for that was that their position, very vocally and very loudly, was that assisted dying was an anathema to palliative care and I should have nothing to do with it. I evidenced this alienating the majority public, otherwise known as hospice supporters, and I recommended that instead we publicly take an organisational position to respect the democratic process, see it as a societal matter, and not lobby for or against. Governance agreed. We published that position and we got on with the job of considering this very particular intersection of health, legal, human values and human rights, and whether we had a place at that intersection. Some of our clinicians began cautiously expressing support for choice and also cautiously expressing that they were scared that it would mean that that would end their careers. We needed to explore the definition of palliative care and also the criteria for eligibility within the end-of-life choice bill in New Zealand. And we needed to encourage dialogue. By 2019, ideology wars between the opposing groups were absolutely raging, including from our own peak body. We viewed this as heading towards a state of loss where opposing ideologies would just leave the patient and all the stakeholders between where despair and despair didn't sound attractive. We maintained a neutral stance and continued to objectively examine academic publications and information from other jurisdictions to understand the potential benefits or the potential harms. As a hospice that had aligned itself with equity of access to and outcome from, and equity between populations, and as a hospice that had committed to a human rights approach on all matters to do with palliative care, we reviewed the Human Rights Act and we reviewed the New Zealand Bill of Rights, and we considered parallels with other human rights cases, such as a woman's right to control her reproductive health or the issue of same-sex marriage. And we found that in jurisdictions where human rights were slow to advance or indeed denied, one could not ignore the influence and presence of religious dogma, social conservatism, or sometimes even downright authoritarianism. When we looked to the positions that were opposed to assisted dying, the main themes appeared to prioritise the perspectives and needs of health professionals over their patients. They often reflected orthodox beliefs on the sanctity of life, the Hippocratic Oath, moral distress for clinicians. They voiced concern for the general erosion of moral values, that vulnerable groups would be harmed, and that palliative care would be somehow increasingly overlooked and underfunded. But they did so without presenting any evidence for that being the case from anywhere. They posited that patients who wished an assisted death were merely despairing temporarily and needed only more care to overcome their feelings. They sought universal legal prohibition of assisted death based on their stance and their belief system. And just objectively, they showed absolute disregard for the suffering of others who did not share their beliefs. We considered that this mirrored the same anti-legalisation approaches and arguments used by groups who opposed advancing human rights in general. When we looked at the pro-assisted death positions, literature and research, in contrast, the main themes were to prioritise the perspectives and needs of the patient. They highlighted the importance of safeguards in legislation and the real-life struggles of those seeking recognition of their human rights cases through the courts. Excuse me. They considered how the Hippocratic Oath had evolved multiple times, particularly since World War II, and it had moved away from religious influence towards more liberal interpretations of harm and care. Excuse me. Importantly, these works highlighted shared goals with palliative care. We found that in jurisdictions with legal AD for the terminally ill, there was no evidence of misuse or a slippery slope. So there was strong alignment based on the facts, not the feelings. After a select committee process and passing its second and third readings and conscience votes in the New Zealand Parliament, the End-of-Life Choice Bill received royal assent in November 19. It was to come into force via the outcome of a public referendum the following year, and that was the result of political horse trading in a very small country with a very small parliament. However, the time to take a position was here. What stuck out for us from our explorations was simply that societal norms change over time because of the effect of activism on evolving interpretations of values and of morality. We identified that palliative care started as an activism movement. It had advocated that dying people deserved a much better deal than the mainstream was offering them. Were we in danger of becoming a new mainstream and failing to listen and thinking that we knew best? We looked to two final areas, the eligibility criteria, excuse me guys, the eligibility criteria and the safeguards in the Act, and the definition of palliative care. I actually feel very well. I don't know what's going on. It's like histamines. So we asked ourselves, were we static or were we evolving? Patients had always asked us over the years about assisted dying. It was really easy to respond to them when it wasn't legal. Lots of our patients were following the law and asking us for a wee pill or a lot more morphine. There was a lot more requests and a lot more conversations. There was a lot more distress in patients as it looked like New Zealand was going to approve a law. A lot more distress that it wasn't going to happen for them. And we wanted to be able to respond to that. So what were the eligibility criteria? Well, it doesn't take a blind man on a galloping horse, does it, to see that the eligibility criteria for assisted dying and the eligibility criteria for hospice were more or less the same eligibility criteria. I'll just hold it here like Madonna. Right? So there was no conflict with that. Safeguards in the bill included specific exclusions, multiple competency assessments, and a robust monitoring and accountability framework. If we were to refuse care for these patients, wouldn't we be making hypocrites of ourselves? Wouldn't we be destroying our accountability contract that was our vision, purpose, and values? It was going to come down to the definition of palliative care. As Greg pointed out, that definition is actually 3 or 4 paragraphs long. It has about 9 bullet points in it. But fundamentally, one bullet point had become the sector's soundbite. The area of contention, the reason for not doing the work. Palliative care neither hastens or postpones death. We put a mirror up to that only for ourselves. And we asked, do our own usual practices truly neither hasten nor postpone death? If we say that we try to respond to individual suffering for each patient, what are we actually doing? We considered pain management, antibiotics, palliative, chemotherapy, spiritual care, emotional care, cessation of eating and drinking, refusal for or commencement or withdrawal of life-sustaining treatments, palliative sedation. We concluded that we were evading and avoiding accountability for honestly answering that question by sitting behind the principle of double effect. On a daily basis, palliative care interventions hasten or postpone death, and we weren't going to say that that wasn't the case anymore. We also looked at the spirit of the definition and how comprehensive it was. And we asked ourselves, surely it just can't be about one bullet point. It's holistic. It talks about easing suffering. So we said, what if that definition was to change to palliative care works holistically to relieve suffering and supports the manner of living and dying as being within the personal legal autonomy of the patient? Would those who didn't support AD claiming that they couldn't support it as a palliative care professional support it in that context? When we respectfully inquired, many of them still said no. We felt that that was not being able to separate your kitchen table from your board table. If that was the case, it wasn't the definition and honesty that was keeping people back, was it? So we reflected that conforming or unquestioning compliance was not in the cultural makeup of Tōtara Hospice. We found and considered the working definition of palliative care by the New Zealand Palliative Care Subcommittee Cancer Treatment Working Party, and I encourage everyone to find that and look at that. They emphasised that for New Zealand, nothing in the definition of palliative care was intended to prohibit the evolution of palliative care in response to the changing needs of society. That for New Zealand, in applying the WHO definition, New Zealand needed to take into account the fundamental place of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, and that palliative care should continue to evolve to meet the changing requirements and expectations of society. Bingo for us. Based on our purpose and values framework, we agreed palliative care did not have to be static. As specialist palliative care providers, we could be proud of our origins, but we were obligated to evolve. After all, we wouldn't send ourselves to a cardiologist, would we? Where she or he said, oh, by the way, I haven't changed my practice for 40 years, and I'm feeling quite proud about that. So, after a long explorative journey with a rough map, a great compass and a willing team, we identified and accepted that values and choice were inextricably linked. Choice is fundamental to human rights, and patient choice is central to our identity as an organisation. There was no conflict with our vision, with our purpose or values. There was alignment. We were going to put our values into action and be authentic and do what we said we did on our packet. And that meant that we were going to be supporting all legal choices for those we had the privilege to care for, not just some. In the words of Matt Vickers, who was Lucretia Seal's husband, choices matter. Choices are what make us human. And without choice, we do not have free will and are held hostage. We were not going to be prisoners, to be prison guards. So the decision was held by governance. We went out to public, said we were going to support the human right to choose, that we were a contemporary palliative care organisation, and that we were going to work with all legal choices, and further we were going to integrate support of an assisted dying service into our usual palliative care services, which we did. On October the 17th, the referendum result was 2/3 majority of New Zealand came out in favour. It was the biggest turnout for a vote in New Zealand's history, bar one. So for anyone who likes to follow politics, 86% of voting New Zealand turned out for that referendum. I'm not going to labour too much on these slides because Jess yesterday has very much gone through them, apart from to say that we've now supported 28 patients to have an assisted death within our service. This year there's been 344 in New Zealand, and palliative care access is not an issue. But also to put it into perspective, it's less than 1% of all deaths in New Zealand. That great moral decline just does not appear to be there. We have been very lucky to work with so many families and patients. And here's a little taster of what they've said. I won't keep them up there for very long, but you get a view. And here's a little taster of what our clinicians and volunteers and other staff have said about the service. So, in our view, it's okay that not every organisation or every health professional wants to or needs to do this work, but every organisation should live their values and be part of a network that does, ensuring an appropriate and equitable response to all patients suffering. We are confident that we've taken the right approach for our patients and for us. As I said, it wasn't methodical and all beautifully set out. It was very instinctive, but it turned out to be the right thing to do. And as I wrap up, I do want to acknowledge the board of Tōtara, the amazing team of people who work at Tōtara that I get to represent, the End of Life Society New Zealand for supporting me to be here. But I want to share with you that 3 years on, the sun still rises and it still sets. There's not been a great apocalyptic crisis. The world has not fallen apart. But a minority of people who wish to choose the time, place, and manner of their inevitable death now have that option. AD is a voluntary choice. It is not a mandatory one. Thank you for listening to Scooby-Doo.